My name is Alan Larsson, and I'm an associate professor with the UCL here in Odense. I'm here with Erin Meyer, the author of the Culture Map, and she just gave a tremendous presentation. So thank you for coming out and talking to us, Erin. It's a pleasure. I'll just paint a picture for you to begin with. What we're working with here in Odense a lot is the robotics industry, and especially training their leaders. Sometimes the leaders, the Danish leaders, have a lot of difficulties training employees that come from 10 or 15 different countries. So in your book, you address this problem, and you have 8 sort of ways of looking at it. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the culture map is a system that breaks culture down into 8 behavioral scales, and it looks at things like how much do we defer to authority, or how do we make decisions differently in different countries. And then we have about 57 countries that are positioned up and down these scales. So if you're from Denmark, you might find that your position on the scale, the composition of your country, impacts how you would train a team. And if you've got people from another part of the scale, they may have different types of expectations than you. So for example, like if you're looking at how to set up a training room, today we talked about this power distance scale, which looks at egalitarian versus hierarchical cultures. And I think for Denmark, that's a very interesting dimension, because Denmark is the most egalitarian country in the world. Yeah. So what that means is that in the classroom, a Danish instructor would often downplay his expertise or his authority. And, in a Danish environment, that makes everybody really comfortable, right? So maybe he wouldn't talk about his, title or his successes. But if you're training people who come from more hierarchical cultures, and you don't talk about your background, you may come off as somebody who is unprepared or not the best person to be in that room. So we have a number of different aspects on the culture map that show you, if you start mapping them out, you can start seeing all different kinds of patterns. Like, for example, another one would be confrontation. So in Denmark, that's actually an interesting one. Like, we could compare even Denmark to Sweden, where we would see that in Denmark, this kind of sparring, like challenging one another, is really accepted. And you can say to me, I can challenge you openly, and that doesn't hurt our relationship. It might even improve our relationship. We just move on a little bit over to Sweden, and we would see that in that culture, that same level of sparring or disagreement would often be felt as confrontational or inappropriate. So just doing our mapping can help us understand those things.
You just described Danes and Swedes very precisely there, I think. And I'll just give you an example of some of the things that we're working on right now. So we're working on a particular company here in Odense that's called Nord Modules. They are sort of a startup. They're 2 years in the making right now. A small company that sprung out from a bigger company that's a global company, Mobile Industrial Robots. And this Nord Module company is, they want us to help building a sales force in the US right now, actually. So I was thinking about something that I heard about a guy that worked in the States. He's not a robot technician. He actually works for Disney. He worked on Cars and some of the big cartoons. And what he told me made me wonder, how do we do this actually? Because he had a reputation for having a truth gun. So when he walked into the room in Disney, the other employees, the American employees, told him, they said, "Here comes Jorgen with the truth gun." And he's Danish. And he was the only one that had that label, So I was wondering, what are we going to do, when we try to train this? Is there something that we should think about when we think about this particular instance?
So I think that's a really interesting one, because 2 of the scales on my culture map make Americans kind of confusing when you're from Europe. So one of them is that Americans are probably the most explicit culture in the world. So we've got a very strong focus in the US on putting things in writing, recapping 3 times, with clarity, transparency, simplicity. That's at all moments except when it comes to talking about something negative. And then when it comes to talking about something negative, we're taught in the US to give 3 positives with every negative, to catch people doing things right. In a business environment, if you see something that you think was bad, then we would have a tendency to start by saying what was done well. And if we just say the part that was bad, either we offend the person we're speaking with, we demotivate our staff, or we seem like we are emoting negative energy. And what I think was interesting about your point was that the word was truth, gun, right? So you can see like the gun, I mean, that's really violent, right? Yeah. And often that we do feel a directness that might come out of Denmark as being kind of like violent, right? So, but I don't think that has to be complicated. I think that if we're aware of that, I mean, if this Danish person were aware of that complication in the US, then he can also focus on giving 3 positives with every negative. And he can say, oh yeah, okay, well, it's not that I'm going to be dishonest, but instead of just focusing on what was done well, I can also think about honestly what was done well, and I can make sure to start with that and show appreciation, which shows respect, and then go on to telling them what I want them to do differently. Okay. I really do feel that humans can be extremely adaptable if we understand what it is that we're supposed to be adapting towards.
So he should adapt his communication skills somewhat.
Oh, I think if he's in the US, he should learn how to do it that way, but he also can laugh at himself. That's another way, you know. Another thing is he can say, oh my gosh, you know, we're so, when you talk about culture, it's always good to use humble words to describe your own culture, right? And positive words to describe the other culture. Yeah. So maybe he would say something like, oh, well, I know in the US, I've seen you're so good at appreciating one another and always pointing out what's good about the situation. But in Denmark, you know, often we don't know how to do that. We just point out the bad. So if I'm doing that, you know, please help me and understand me, right? Yeah. And I think just bringing that up, it makes people recognize, okay, well, this is something cultural going on here. It's not that this guy doesn't know how to communicate well, or he's lacking leadership skills, or he's demotivational.
Mm-hmm. So these sometimes there's it seems like there's a sort of a dichotomy. We are very egalitarian, but very confrontational. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I don't think that those two things are in conflict at all. No. I mean, we could also see that many other countries, like the Japanese, are very hierarchical and very avoid confrontation. So that's a pretty natural combination. One of the reasons it's natural is that in egalitarian cultures, I can also confront the boss, right? I don't just disagree with someone on my level, I disagree with people at other levels. And that's where Danes have to be really careful.
You know why?
Well, because now if you're working in a culture that's a little more hierarchical and a little more avoid confrontation, and the Danish style to maybe get a debate going with someone who's higher level than them is likely to really get them in trouble. I mean, might even get them fired, right? Because it comes off as such a sign of arrogance or disrespect.
Yeah. Okay. So some of these companies here in Odense have 10 or 15 nationalities actually. Because they are highly skilled workers, engineers, computer programmers, tech people. So if you were a leader of one of these companies, where would you start? You know, because I think that many of these leaders have a hard time, you know, making these foreigners feel maybe welcomed and appreciated. And where would you start if you had like two things that you would tell them?
Okay. Before I answer the question, I do want to say that depending on how long people have been in this country, of course, they may have adapted, right? I mean, I think that's important to point out. Like we had this Indian woman who spoke up in the class today, and she said she's from India, but she's been in Denmark for, I think she said 7 years. Now, whether she still behaves in an Indian way or whether she's become entirely Danish, I mean, who's to say? So I do think it's important that we keep that in mind. Just because someone's from another country doesn't mean that they're not behaving Danish. But Assuming that that's not the case, I mean, I just have one main piece of advice, which is talk, talk, talk. I mean, I think that the more we show curiosity and ask questions, everyone likes to talk about their own culture. So as long as we ask questions with humility and interest in the other cultures, like, you know, oh, in Denmark, I know we always do this like open disagreement. Do you guys do that in your culture? Right? Or in my culture, it's really appropriate to email someone who's way at the top of the organization, even your receptionist. Is that appropriate in your culture? Right? And the more that we ask questions with humility, the more, I mean, everyone will start sharing ideas. And you know, so I also hope, I have this culture mapping tool that I shared with the group today. I also hope that people will start doing their maps and getting discussions started. There's no truth. I mean, every individual is different. But the maps can start a discussion, and the more we talk, the more we learn, the better we work together.
This research is fascinating to me. Where will it be in 50 years, you think?
50? Oh gosh, I have no idea. I'm just looking down the road. We've made a lot of progress just in the next 10 years. And my main point is that there are huge parts of the world that we have not looked at yet. So I'd like to, for example, map out differences across some of the bigger countries. Right now, I just have one position for India, but India has enormous regional differences. We have many, many countries in Africa that we haven't looked at, and Africa is up and coming. So I think we have a lot more with the world we can do. And I just finished another book that looks at corporate culture. And that's another important point, is that when we interact, it's not just our national culture, but also our corporate culture that influences us. So we can look at both of those things together.
Could you tell a little bit about the difference between the new book and the older one?
Yeah, well, the new book looks at how to create a corporate culture for the new age. So if you're looking at agility, how to create an agile company. And it also talks then about, as you internationalize, how to adapt that agility to the different markets that you're working in.
Thank you so much, Erin.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.